Okay, let's dive right into this. Today we're unpacking what is widely considered the absolute largest bankruptcy of a private enterprise in European history. We're talking about the spectacular rise and, well, the totally catastrophic fall of the Italian dairy giant Parmalat. But look, we aren't just going to sit here and tally up balance sheets today. Instead, we're going to examine the very foundation that allowed this staggering scandal to operate completely in the shadows for over a decade. We're talking about the deeply entrenched political ties that held the whole crazy thing together.
14 billion euros. I mean, just take a second to let that number actually sink in. That was the catastrophic hole ultimately discovered in Parmalat's accounts by the end of 2003. It's a sum so massive it almost defies comprehension, honestly. We're talking roughly $20 billion or 13 billion pounds at the time. Hundreds of thousands of everyday investors lost their money, never to see it again. But, a deception of this magnitude, it doesn't just happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen in a vacuum. To understand exactly how a 14 billion euro hole was sustained and hidden for so long, we first have to understand the illusion that Parmalat was selling to the world.
Section 1. The Dairy Empire's Facade. So, the public story of Parmalat was honestly nothing short of an Italian fairy tale, growing from a tiny pasteurization plant back in 1961 into this massive global powerhouse pioneered by Calisto Tanzi. And this brilliantly illustrates the jarring duality of the Parmalat empire. On one hand, you had the public glory. Parmalat was literally everywhere. They were a ubiquitous global brand, totally fueled by the revolutionary UHT milk, the kind that could last for months without being refrigerated. They were the title sponsor of the Brabham Formula One team, backing absolute legends like Niki Lauda and Nelson Piquet. They bought Parma FC, transforming a local football club into European champions in the 90s. They even sponsored iconic teams like Boca Juniors and Real Madrid. But then, there was the hidden reality. Because behind all those glittering sports trophies and massive global expansion, the company was actually building a highly leveraged, completely unpayable mountain of debt. Their expansion into places like Eastern Europe, it failed catastrophically, especially after the 1986 Chernobyl disaster totally decimated agricultural land values. Basically, the company was bleeding cash.
Section 2. The quid pro quo. So, how on earth did they hide this mountain of debt? Well, we're going to pivot sharply now to the core mechanism that kept Parmalat afloat. It wasn't just clever accounting. It was a deeply entrenched web of mutual backscratching with Italian politicians. Calisto Tanzi realized pretty early on that to protect his extremely vulnerable, debt-ridden empire, he was going to need some very powerful friends.
Back in the early 1980s, a local builder actually introduced Tanzi to Ciriaco de Mita, who was an incredibly powerful figure in the dominant Democrazia Cristiano party. A strong friendship quickly formed, and well, so did the flow of favors. Tanzi showed his gratitude right away by financing a failing auto company called Rayton Fisser. And get this, it was a company owned by the very man who introduced him to de Mita. He pumped 1.5 billion lire into it through a phantom company. And the political returns for Parmalat? Oh, they were immediate. After the devastating 1980 Irpinia earthquake, the government allocated reconstruction funds. Tanzi applied for 8 billion lire in relief funds for Parmalat. Even though his application was submitted 10 days past the deadline, wait for it, he didn't just get the money, he was awarded 11 billion lire, and shortly after that in 1984, Parmalat conveniently opened a brand new industrial plant in Irpinia. Where exactly, you ask? In Nusco, which just so happened to be the hometown of Ciriaco de Mita. The factory's construction was even contracted out to de Mita's brother. You honestly can't make this stuff up.
Section 3. Buying political favors. Parmalat at this point was operating a systemic political patronage machine. They really weren't just a dairy company anymore. They essentially became a repository for the financial mistakes of powerful people, absorbing all these toxic assets just to keep the regulatory wolves at bay.
Let's look at exactly how Parmalat bought this favor, step by step. Take Ciriaco de Mita again, for instance. When around 80 travel agencies linked to him were facing insolvency, Tanzi simply agreed to have Parmalat acquire them. Problem solved. Or take Francesco Cossiga, another towering political figure. Based on his indication, Parmalat incorporated Margherita Yogurt. This was a heavily indebted company where Cossiga reportedly had relatives as partners. And then there's Calogero Manino. He intervened to have Parmalat rescue the Sicilian company Cipro Sicilia, bringing its crushing 150 billion lira debt straight onto Parmalat's already strained books. By voluntarily taking on the political elite's failing businesses, Parmalat effectively purchased a rock-solid insurance policy against any kind of official scrutiny. Now, what's really interesting about all this is how politically agnostic this patronage actually was. Parmalat absolutely did not play favorites. They bought protection across the entire political spectrum. The sources show that back in 1996, Tanzi became a partner in Numisma, which was a company founded by Romano Prodi, and he poured vast sums into financing the center-left campaign for the 1996 elections. But fast forward to 2001, Tanzi was suddenly providing financial support to Silvio Berlusconi's center-right campaign. He reportedly did this through a mechanism of massive, undiscounted advertising spends on Mediaset networks that indirectly benefited the political party Forza Italia. So left or right, it really didn't matter. The money flowed where it needed to.
And of course, to ensure journalists wouldn't look too closely at this massive political corporate alliance, Tanzi also made sure to buy media silence. Parmalat spent 250 million lira purchasing shares in the left-wing newspaper Il Manifesto, and simultaneously funneled somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion lira into the conservative paper Il Folio. By distributing funds across the political and media divide, Parmalat practically guaranteed that literally no one in power had any incentive to investigate their massive growing debt.
Section 4. The Legislative Shield. We've seen exactly what Parmalat gave to the politicians, but what did this sprawling patronage machine actually yield in return? Well, it yielded a massive, customized legislative shield.
So, the crucial point here is how this played out in the law. When Parmalat was preparing to launch its revolutionary UHT milk back in the late 80s, there were actually no regulations for it at all. But, very conveniently, in 1989, the Demita government swiftly passed Law 169, which perfectly regularized Parmalat's position in the market. Talk about timing, right? Then, years later in 2001, Parmalat launched Fresco Blue, which was a microfiltered milk they aggressively advertised with an 8-day expiration date. Competitors were absolutely furious. They noted that, by law, only milk with a 4-day expiration could legally be labeled fresh. Parmalat was slapped with a fraud fine and immediately ordered to halt distribution. But Tanzi just sent an emissary to Gianni Alamano, the Minister for Agricultural Policies. Just like that, the minister gave the green light for Fresco Blue to continue. Oh, and he later took an initially unpaid vacation at a Parmatur resort down in Zanzibar.
Section 5. Banks and blind eyes. So, with politicians effectively neutralized as watchdogs, the regulators were basically looking the other way. And this created the perfect dark environment for banks to step in, facilitate, and deeply profit from the rapidly accelerating fraud.
As this debt grew totally out of control, Parmalat literally had to invent money. One of their main tools was something called the double billing scheme. The company would literally just duplicate invoices when their products were sold to retailers. These totally fake duplicate invoices were then reported as increased revenue. Parmalat would take these fabricated invoices straight to the banks and use them as collateral to obtain massive new loans, artificially inflating their cash assets. They also sold themselves credit-linked notes, which is basically placing bets on their own creditworthiness just to conjure assets out of thin air. It's like a giant financial house of cards.
And the wild part is, major international banks were deeply entangled in this entire mess. Bank of America was listed as the bank for Parmalat, which was a Cayman Islands offshore subsidiary used to hide non-existent cash. Citibank allegedly operated behind a shell company literally named Bucanero, which, I kid you not, translates to black hole, to secretly funnel 100 billion lira into Parmalat without it ever appearing as debt on the books. Then in 2002, Banca di Roma provided a 50 million euro loan, but allegedly pressured Tanzi to buy the indebted Siapazzi company. This effectively used Parmalat's public bonds to pay off Siapazzi's bad debts to the bank. And we absolutely can't forget the Epicrum Fund, a totally fictitious Cayman-based mutual fund that claimed to hold 600 million euros in liquidity, literally just to fool the markets.
Section 6. The 14 billion hole. For 13 years, this elaborate, delicate dance of political favors, media silence, and banking complicity kept the plates spinning. But by late 2003, the debt was just too massive to conceal anymore. The facade finally and violently cracked.
Let's move right through this timeline and see how this builds into an absolute avalanche in December 2003. On December 4th, the truth about the Cayman-based Epicrum Fund finally leaked. That 600 million euros, it just didn't exist. 2 days later, a very desperate Calisto Tanzi met with major banks in Rome and finally admitted there was a multi-billion euro hole. Yet incredibly, the sale of Parmalat bonds wasn't immediately suspended. The real panic finally hit on December 8th, when Parmalat flat out missed a 150 million euro bond payment. And then, the final, fatal blow landed on December 18th.
Regulators have been asking the obvious question.
Why couldn't a company claiming to have nearly 4 billion euros in liquidity pay a measly 150 million euro bond? Well, the auditors pointed to an official Bank of America document dated March 6, which showed 3.95 billion euros sitting safely in that Parmalat offshore account. But on the night of December 17th, Bank of America sent a message that completely shattered the empire. They stated bluntly, the document of March 6 is entirely false. The Parmalat account did not exist at all. It was actually later revealed that this critical document, the one proving the existence of nearly 4 billion euros, had been clumsily forged by Parmalat executives in their own offices using a standard desktop scanner. Seriously, a scanner.
So, what does this all mean? It brings us to our final, lingering question. How does a 14 billion euro corporate fraud operate in plain sight for over a decade? Calisto Tanzi went to prison, sure, but as we've seen today, he absolutely did not build this illusion alone. Parmalat's rise was undeniably inextricably tied to its deep, symbiotic relationship with the Italian political structure. It leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. When a corporation begins paying the debts of politicians, silencing the media, and enriching the banks, do they become too big to fail? Or do they just become too politically connected to investigate, at least until the very last drop of reality finally spills over? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive helped you grasp the incredible mechanics behind the Parmalat scandal.